Hi folks, Lou here, and I'm going to talk this time about sensible monster behavior in RPGs, role-playing games. So the question is, should monsters behave sensibly? And you might substitute realistically in RPGs. People are all over the map about this, from a clear yes to a clear no, and everywhere in between. My answer is yes. And I'm going to quote myself from 40 odd years ago to sort of illustrate. Quote, D&D is a simulation of life, a life we believe could exist but does not, unquote. And of course by that I meant it doesn't have to be silly, it doesn't have to be brain fever. It can make sense the way a good fantasy novel makes sense. There's a big divide here. Two sides, two schools of thought. The first is characterized by a statement by Robert McKee, who was talking about novels. We give the fantasy author one giant leap away from reality, then demand tight-knit probabilities and no coincidences thereafter. The second is dominated by the rule of cool, that if it's cool, put it in. And the result is that any kind of verisimilitude or realism is sneered at. Now I'm going to give you an example. Someone else said this. Unfortunately, I don't have the reference as to who it was. I think the main one for me is to make sure the monster doesn't just pop out and fight for no reason. What is the monster doing when you encounter it? Perhaps it is suckling its young and wants to protect them. If the monster is intelligent, perhaps it talks, negotiates, offers a job. Where is the monster and why? It could be out hunting, hibernating in a cave, building a nest, whatever. Give the players a reason to interact with the monster. Think of the situations where you might encounter a bear and what would motivate you to interact with it. The anti-pattern is to open a door into a featureless stone room and have a bunch of monsters attack and fight to the death, unquote. And the real annoyance here is the monsters that don't make sense where they are and are just there to fight. Now, old timers, including me, all started the second way because that's how Gary Gygax taught us. But some of us grew up and decided that this didn't make sense. So we want to make sure the monsters don't just show up and fight for no reason. Why are they there? Why are they hostile? Why don't they negotiate? Automatically fighting can put the monster in the dead book after all. That doesn't sound very smart. Conversely, why do the player characters want to fight? For experience points? What's that? That's a game thing. That's not a reality thing. For treasure? But so many monsters are, in reality, unlikely to have significant treasure. Aren't the party mission-oriented? Don't they have a mission in mind that they want to achieve? And so they should only fight when it's necessary and when it's unavoidable. And yet, so often we see monsters that are willing to fight in almost any circumstances, and players who are willing to fight in almost any circumstances. You can consider the ecology, the ecological place of the monster in its residence, if it's in its residence, and that ought to make sense. Why do they live here? Where do they get their food? What about waste disposal and ventilation? I've occasionally populated a dungeon, which often isn't actually a dungeon, by having monsters wander in and find their niche, which might include kicking someone else out. It's an interesting exercise for me. And after an adventure, I run more in so that the dungeon isn't exactly like the players left it, which is what would happen in reality unless the players came back very soon. I should say player characters. The monsters should have tactics too, at least the intelligent ones. For example, and I have not read any of this, there is a series of books by Keith Ammann, which are from an online column called The Monsters Know What They're Doing. The monster bonsai charge that's so common amongst some groups may do no more good for the monsters than it did for the Japanese in World War II, where it was usually suicidal desperation. Sensible monster behavior helps the players. When the monsters make sense, the players can act more rationally as well. On the other hand, if anything can happen, how can you create a plan or a strategy? Think about it. So ask yourself, does this make sense? And you may be doing the players a favor. Thanks for listening.